If you build websites, you've probably noticed Astro coming up more and more lately. And if your first reaction is something like, oh, great, another thing I'm supposed to care about, well, I get that. It seems like there's always something new to learn, so you have to be able to figure out what to spend your time on and what you can let go. This video isn't a tutorial, it's not a recommendation, and it definitely isn't about switching tools. It's just about understanding why Astro exists at all, and whether it's even worth thinking about in the context of the kind of sites WordPress agencies build. So if you think you're actually going to learn something from me today, guess again. Let's back up and chat about WordPress for a minute. Most WordPress agencies know about the trade-offs of the tools that we use. On one hand, WordPress is powerful. It's flexible, it has real editorial workflows, and it solves a lot of client problems very well. On the other hand, for certain projects, it can start to feel like a bit much. Not that that's bad, it just doesn't always feel like the right fit. At the same time, the alternatives aren't always satisfying either. Then there are the plain static HTML sites. These are simple and predictable, but they don't always scale well once the site's content or structure starts to grow. DIY and hosted builders, they trade flexibility for convenience, and AI site builders, they trade control for speed. So a lot of teams find themselves looking at this space between static sites, DIY platforms, and full-on CMS-driven systems, trying to figure out just what actually fits. Astro shows up in that space. Now, this isn't about WordPress being the wrong tool. It's about the kind of pressures that agencies deal with over time. Long-term maintainability, content ownership, editorial complexity, keeping sites understandable years later, not just at launch. A lot of newer tools are responses to those pressures in different ways. Astro is just one of those responses, and whether it's relevant or not depends entirely on context. So at a very high level, and I mean a very high level, what is Astro? Astro is a way to build websites where HTML is the default output, not a side effect. JavaScript is optional, not assumed. And structure and content are treated explicitly instead of being hidden behind a lot of runtime behavior. That's it. No setup details, no frameworks, no mechanics. This is about architecture and philosophy, not about features. Now let's talk about risk. When agencies evaluate tools like this, the question usually isn't, is it good? It's, what does this cost us if it goes away? That cost is about retraining, rewriting, and explaining decisions to your clients years later. Astro feels different today, not because it suddenly does more, but because it's no longer a fragile side project. There's a growing ecosystem and real-world usage, and clearer signals about where it's going. Astro is now part of Cloudflare, and that's one of those signals. It's not a guarantee, and it's not a reason to adopt. It's just a reduction in long-term uncertainty. Now, please, take this all as context, not as an endorsement. In fact, I want to be really clear about something. If WordPress already feels like the right tool for the sites that you build, and you're happy with that, you don't need Astro. There's no upgrade you're missing on, there's nothing you're behind on. And for a lot of projects, maybe even for most projects, WordPress is exactly the correct choice. This conversation only matters if you've felt friction in very specific situations. And if you haven't, that's fine. It's a tool, not a religion. So when is it worth thinking about Astro? Astro tends to come up around certain kinds of questions. Questions like, how long does this site need to last? Who really owns the structure and the content? How much complexity do we actually need? And what do we want maintenance to feel like 2 or 3 years from now? Those aren't Astro questions, really. They're architecture questions. Astro is just one way some teams are choosing to answer them. The point of this video isn't to convince you of anything. It's just to help you think about the landscape you're already working in. If this framing was useful, I would genuinely like to know. What kind of sites do you build? Where does WordPress feel exactly right? And where do you feel like it starts to be a little bit heavier than you want? That feedback matters more than views or likes, and it'll help determine whether this topic is worth digging into any further. And remember, understanding your options is way more valuable than adopting new tools. This video is about clarity, not about change. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.